آله وصحبه أجمعين. And I was unable to bring you to order. With my students, I tend to start abusing. I pick out one or two of them and start making fun of them, but I didn't want to do that with you, a foreign country. So we will continue the study of Orientalism. Now, I told Mizan, I said, I think I'm not giving you your whatever equivalent, metaphorical equivalent of money's worth, because this is all in my book. So I feel really bad. You can read this in the book, but I hope it benefits you, which is good. So this study of the Hadith tradition by scholars like Goldziher, Muir, Schacht does not go uncontested. It doesn't go uncontested in the Western Academy. It doesn't go uncontested by Muslim scholars writing in English or writing against some of these critics. And what you see is that there's, in the second half of the 20th century, you find a number of scholars, some of them of Middle Eastern origin, some of them Muslim, some of them Christians. People like Nabia Abbott. I've been told her original name was Nabiha Aboud. I don't know if this is accurate. The person who told me this is generally reliable, but sometimes is not. Like all of us, like myself included. So Nabia Abbott was originally, she's an Iraqi Christian, and she moved to the United States, and she eventually became a professor at the University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago Oriental Institute has a collection of early Arabic papyri, and also not just papyri, but paper copies of segments of the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal from the 800s of the Common Era. This is very important, by the way, and I'm going to be jumping ahead of myself. It's the second item here. I will shut up and follow my own instruction. Abbott, and I think I don't want to sort of assign intentions to her that she might not have had, but I get the sense from her work that she was standing up for a tradition that she felt was not being given its due credit. It was not being taken seriously enough. She wasn't Muslim. I don't think that she was defending Islam as a religion, but she was defending what she felt was a tradition that had not been studied with a seriousness that it deserved, with the seriousness it deserved. Very important, so looking at these papyrus fragments, which came from the late 700s of the Common Era, mid to late 700s. So we're talking around the time of Malik and his students. She came to a few conclusions. And I'll just give you some of the explanation she offers for what Goldziher and Schacht and Ewing had found. Okay. So no one is disputing that a hadith in the of al-Shafi'i is, the hadith in Muwatta of Malik is something a successor said. And then in the of al-Shafi'i it's something the companion says. And then in Sahih Bukhari it's something the Prophet said. No one is disputing that fact. I'm not trying to say that's the only evidence out there. How do we explain this? One of the things that Ewing talks about is that, you look in Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, or you look at, the number of hadiths attributed to the companion Ibn Abbas, 1,600 hadiths maybe, 1,600 hadiths. And yet you find reports that Ibn Abbas only transmitted 9 hadiths, sometimes. Ibn Abbas was either 9 or 14 years old when the Prophet died. How could he hear all these hadiths? You hear this often with Abu Hurairah. This is, by the way, the worst argument I've ever heard in my life. Anytime everyone gives you this argument, I don't care what you think about hadith, if you believe them or not, but this argument is idiotic. The argument that Abu Hurairah only knew the Prophet for 3 years, so how did he hear, these over 5,000 hadiths? Because he didn't hear them all from the Prophet, obviously, duh. He doesn't say, I heard the Prophet say. It's very rarely do you see Abu Hurairah quoting the Prophet directly. He's hearing it from other companions. And he doesn't quote them because, like normal human beings, we don't go around quoting, for example, I don't go around telling you who told me, who they heard from, who heard from Martin Luther King. I just quote Martin Luther King because that's what normal people do. They don't give their chains of transmission for stuff that's just in their daily life. It's only later on when Muslims become obsessed with isnads and trains of transmission that they start doing that. It's completely normal. So this is I kind of got off topic, but this is important. When you see these, how do you explain the fact that someone says Ibn Abbas only transmits, a small number of hadiths, but then there's thousands of narrations of this hadith that are attributed to him? One of the things that Abbott says is that this is a very important point. Early scholars, and actually Muslim scholars till this day, use the word hadith to indicate two different things. And this is an example. People love to say how Arabic is this perfect language that can communicate. Actually, sometimes Arabic is not the best language, or at least the way it's used is not the best way. And sometimes English can be more useful, because there's a difference between traditions and what I say called traditions and narrations, between hadith and riwayah. Hadith and riwayah. A hadith, or tradition, we can think about being a general idea of something the Prophet said. To give this earlier example, whoever lies about me intentionally, let him prepare for himself a seat in hell. This is something the Prophet said. Now, there's lots of different versions of this. There's some versions that lack certain words, that add certain words. Because there's all these narrations of this one tradition. From 60 companions, 70 companions, 80 companions. Other hadiths maybe from 2 companions, 4 companions. You have lots of different narrations of one tradition. Sometimes the Prophet might have said it more than once, and different companions heard him on different occasions. Muslim scholars, when they speak of hadiths, will generally associate them with a companion. A hadith is something that a specific companion heard the Prophet say. So you'll have instances in which they are talking about the hadith of Ibn Umar, the hadith of Ibn Abbas, and you're saying to yourself, wait a second, this is the same hadith. I mean, it's the same general thing the Prophet said. Why are there different hadiths here? Because hadith is being used to indicate the transmissions of these different companions of one tradition. When someone says that Ahmad ibn Hanbal selected the Musnad from 750,000 hadiths, that doesn't mean that there's 750,000 different things the Prophet said. These are 750,000 different narrations. And if you imagine how these narrations ramify as people sit and study and transmit and spread knowledge, this is not difficult to believe. When they say, how could the very fact that all these things spread in this number means that so much is being made up, obviously. If companions are transmitting 5,000 hadiths at the most, how can you have 750,000 hadiths later on? Some obviously are made up, and Muslim scholars, by the way, had no problem admitting that. That's why they started the science of hadith criticism. They didn't start it because they had free time and didn't have anything to do. They had a problem, which is people were making up hadiths. Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, who died in 160, the famous Basra and hadith critic, he said 3/4 of the hadiths I find are made up. The ones that I come across, 3/4 of them are made up. But this multiplication is because you have to remember that they might be talking about narrations of hadiths, not just the actual tradition that the Prophet said. So this is an important distinction that Abbott highlights. Second, technology. You all have paper. You're writing on paper. Isn't that wonderful? Well, some of you are writing on electronic devices, which is even more wonderful. Unless there's an electromagnetic pulse weapon that goes off, in which case you're all toast. Technology is important. Before this wonderful product of wood pulp that's mashed and pressed, and then you get this great thing called paper. Before Muslims had that in the late 700s, late 700s, around 790, 780, it starts coming in from Central Asia to places like Baghdad. What are they writing on? Papyrus. Papyrus is very expensive. You take this reed from the Nile River and a few other places, and you cut it into little sheets, and you paste them together. It's kind of sticky, and you put some solution on it to stick it together. You get a sheet that's yay wide maybe, and as long as the reed is, and you paste these together, and you get a long scroll, and that's how basically that's how you write books until around 200, 300 of the Common Era. Book is actually a scroll. The idea of a book that opens like this, a codex, this really starts appearing in around 200 to 300 of the Common Era. But still papyrus, or vellum, what's called parchment, treated animal skin. Also, papyrus is expensive, vellum is expensive, parchment is expensive. How many rabbits can I kill? How many goats can I kill? And sheep can I kill? And segments of sheepskin can I get to write a book? This is expensive stuff, people. You can't write a lot. That's why, the Zuhri, Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, who died 124, 742 of the Common Era, very important transmitter from Medina and Syria. His whole library could fit into one saddlebag. He'd carry it in his, this is the reports. Hassan al-Basri, famous Basran scholar, died in 110, 728 of the Common Era. His knowledge was on this scroll, papyrus scroll, about 6 inches in diameter. Ahmed ibn Hanbal's library was 12 and a half camel loads of books. Scholars like At-Tabari, many, many dozens of camel loads of books. Huge amounts of material. How do we explain this? Ahmed ibn Hanbal, 12 and a half camel loads of books. Zuhri, 1 saddlebag. How do we explain this difference? Ahmed ibn Hanbal had paper, people. He had paper. It's cheap, you can write. And it's also not that thick. If you see, parchment is, even if you thin it out, it's still pretty thick. If you see these, like the Mus'haf Uthmani in Istanbul or in Tashkent, these things are like, they're like this big, and they're huge. It's not something you can carry with you. Paper allows you to write stuff down. When someone like a Zuhri or these early scholars in the mid-700s are writing, they're not writing all the versions of a hadith down that they find. They don't have the space. What they're writing is basically notes to jog their memory. That's why they were so careful about making sure that they read their hadiths to people, that people didn't just look at their notes, that some of them buried their material after they died or burned it. Because it's like reading my lecture notes, not these ones. If you read my lecture notes, you will think I'm an utter lunatic. And you will not get the correct idea about what I'm trying to say, because you'll see bizarre language, misspelling, weird scribbles, coffee stains, things like that. Not accurate. When you get paper, you can just start writing down all the hadiths you hear, all the narrations of hadiths you hear. Ahmed ibn Hanbal's Musnad, which he selected from his corpus of hadith that he collected, is huge. About 40,000, it depends. Around, I think the best count is about 27,000 narrations, anywhere between a third and a fourth of which are repetitions. You can actually start writing down, when people say musnads of scholars, the musnad of someone like Qutayb bin Sa'id, the musnad of Baqi ibn Mukhlad, this is literally their hadith collection, what they collect over their lifetime of collection. And then they might select from this material to put into different books that they would use for different purposes. But you can have people who are actually collecting. Some books, the Mu'jam of a scholar named al-Masarjisi, who died in 360, about 970 of the Common Era. I think I calculated this. it's in my book on Bukhari and Muslim. I think if it were published, it doesn't exist because only a madman would copy something so big, or someone with a lot of free time. It doesn't exist, it didn't survive. But it would be something like 200 volumes, I think I calculated. It would be 200 volumes in a library today if it were published. Huge collections. Yes?
Isn't it possible also we have to remember the context of the society we're living in? Remember, this is a society early on in Islam where it was very much oral tradition. And therefore, we need books to remember or to refer to. And scholars at that time often memorized things with a tremendous amount of memory. Like, for example, Imam Shafi, I've heard, could almost memorize a book with one reading. And when they therefore gave that knowledge on with the Ijaza system to some of their students, it's perfectly conceivable.
I mean, people did, it's important to remember that knowledge is primarily oral. Right? These books exist to jog your memory. The Quran in a mushaf is not the Quran, it's just there to jog your memory, basically. But it's also important to remember that once someone like a Zuhri, yes, their knowledge primarily oral. They had written, Zuhri was a big advocate of writing knowledge down because writing is important. You know, we can talk about how they had great memories, and scholars, Muslim scholars to this day have amazing memories. I was the first person to throw myself at their feet and wish that I could have memories like that. But they also understood that memory fails you. Memory fails you, and you need to have written copies. Bukhari says this in one of his books, I think, praying behind reading behind the Imam in prayer. He favors written, if someone has written material, he favors this over someone who doesn't have written material. So you can check that. It's very important. So Ahmed ibn Hanbal, you can't memorize the Musnad. I would be surprised if someone memorized the Musnad word for word. This would surprise me. You can't do that, you have to write it down. And if you do it, you certainly are not going to be able to be reliable. Because how could someone possibly know you're being accurate? Okay.
My last question.
So another important distinction, point made by Abbott, is that and it's something that I've ended up studying a lot. Muslim scholars treated different subjects of hadith differently. They were, and they say this very clearly, you have this attributed to Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi, his teacher, to other figures from his generation, from the late 700s to the early 800s. If a hadith comes to me dealing with halal and haram, dealing with ahkam, dealing with fara'id, inheritance, dealing with salah, prayer, we are strict about the isnads. If someone brings me a hadith about the virtues of actions, this and such an action will get you such and such a reward in paradise, about adab, manners, about preaching, things that will make people, soften their hearts, then we're not strict about the isnad. They said this very explicitly. That example I gave earlier about a hadith that says, be good to your mother. Why are you going to sit and spend your time criticizing this to see if the Prophet really said this? Because you know you have to be good to your mother already. If you find a hadith that says you have to divide up your inheritance in this specific way, you better treat that critically, because this is going to affect people's lives, it's going to affect the law. So we need to be sensitive to what the subject is that they're looking at. You can't, let's say, look at how a Muslim scholar is dealing with. Ahmed ibn Hanbal has a kitab al-Zuhd, book of asceticism. This book is so much material in it. It's very odd. Stuff about Moses and Jesus and all sorts of sources. It's like, Ahmed ibn Hanbal, he must really have been he really didn't understand how to be critical. Because it is not a serious issue for him. This is not an issue that needs to be treated with the rigor of law, hadiths about law. And much of these, especially if it's not coming from the Prophet, ﷺ, it's coming from earlier prophets like Moses and Jesus, if it's coming from companions, they just didn't spend that much time criticizing it. Because it wasn't, it's there to benefit from you, to benefit you. They didn't think that it was going to alter core areas of the religion. Other scholars. Andrew mentioned Professor Althamy. You know, I'm going to reveal my biases. Actually, I would say I'm going to reveal maybe the latent racism that is part of life in the West, and the way that people think about Muslim scholars. When his book on Schacht, his criticism of Schacht, I saw this book and I did not read it. I didn't read it because I thought there's going to be some Muslim scholar who's saying stupid stuff that isn't going to convince anybody, and it's just going to be a pietistic attempt to rebut a Western scholar, and it's not going to convince anybody. I'm not going to waste my time. So when I was writing my book on Hadith, I said, you know, I need to be, I actually have to look at the book, I have to be thorough. I can't just, I have to say something about it. Yeah, maybe a few lines I'll put in. You're reading this book. This is an excellent book. These are really good arguments. And I ended up including, you know, I think maybe a whole page, which is a book, a relatively small book, it's a lot. It was an excellent book. I was extremely impressed. And I immediately took this lesson into consideration and, you know, rebuked myself for my prejudices and for my assumptions. So it's important that we, maybe it isn't important, but I will confess my initial approach and I will confess my error. And if Professor Azami ever sees this lecture, he can take this as my praise for his book. He makes a number of important corrections to Schacht's work. One of them is, and this is an excellent point, he doesn't say it in as many words, but it's certainly in the book, which is this Hadith tradition is vast. The Hadith tradition is vast. Just the 6 books, you're talking about this much book. You add Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, you're talking this much book. You add a few other books, you're talking about the whole wall lined with books. You add just the printed Hadith books of the Sunni tradition, this whole wall easily. Then the whole other wall, then the whole other wall, then the whole room fills up. This is a massive amount of material. All these judgments, all these criticisms, are by definition based on a small sampling of that material. So, whatever we say about this material, however we look at it, I could come into the room and I could say, I'm going to assume that these things attributed to the Prophet are authentic until proven otherwise. That's one approach. I could come in and say, this is all made up. Maybe there's some accurate stuff in there, but the assumption is this is all made up. Or I could say, I honestly have no idea. I just have no position. The position of the Orientalist tradition really had been, with Schacht and Oneworld, had been, this is all made up. But based on what? Based on a small amount of information that had been studied. A tiny, tiny fragment. Is that really an accurate way to judge? I mean, this is a very good question. Is that really an accurate way to judge things? You might look at a few traditions and decide that they're made up. But what if they're the exception, not the rule? As I said before, you know, the Prophet existed. We know that. And assuming that he was like other prophets, you know, that he said things, and that people cared about what he said, it's not inconceivable that somebody wrote this down or transmitted it. It's not inconceivable that he said something over the 23 years of his life. So, and it's also, if people really cared about his words and deeds, it's not inconceivable that there was quite a bit of material that was recorded from him, transmitted from him. And why should we doubt that there's several books full of material that the Prophet said somewhere? I mean, why should we doubt that? not everything that's attributed to him should simply be dismissed as automatically made up. Because something out there, he said something out there. The question is, how do I identify it? When Goldziher and Schacht looked at the material they examined, especially with Goldziher, you'll find that he'll give you an example. Let's say Ghiyath bin Ibrahim. Ghiyath bin Ibrahim he gives us an example of someone who forged a hadith for political reasons. He was in the court of the Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasid Caliph liked pigeons or doves, and so he made up a hadith that says there's no gambling or racing animals except something that has a hoof or a wing. I'm just summarizing the hadith. He adds a winged thing in there. So now I'm allowing you to race and raise and gamble pigeons. Now, this material, this hadith, Goldziher says someone made up this hadith to curry favor with the court. But this hadith doesn't exist anywhere. No, this hadith isn't in like Bukhari. This story only exists in Muslim books on hadith criticism, where they're giving you an example of somebody who's forging a hadith for political reasons. So, I mean, it's like taking, that's like I have a book of instances in which I've caught students cheating. How do you identify a student cheating? Here's an example. And then someone comes and finds this book and says, look at how much the students were cheating. See this? This is not a good argument, because I'm listing this as an exception. And oftentimes you'll see this, that the material that is being used to criticize the hadith tradition is stuff that Muslim scholars themselves have put forward as being made up. This hadith about Muawiyah being under the throne of God, no one thinks this is authentic hadith that I know of. I mean, this is included in books, but it's either just not described, which is, I think, a fault on the part of Muslim scholars, and it's a fault that numerous Muslim scholars like al-Dhahabi and Ibn Hajar mentioned centuries ago. They said you can't just list something and not say it's forged, because if you list something and you're quiet, the assumption is that you think it's accurate. But a lot of these hadiths, Muslim scholars themselves acknowledge were made up. Just because it's in a book doesn't mean they think it's accurate. It's not in Sahih al-Bukhari. It's not in Sahih Muslim. Another important point that Adami makes is that Sheikhs had relied on a very small number of books. The of a Shafi'i, the 6 books. These are not in any way exhaustive, or even, they don't exhaust even a portion of the material, of the hadith material that existed at the times of their authors, or the material that exists today that's published from that period, or the material that exists today as in manuscript form. So if you're going to make arguments about from silence, e silentio, you're going to say that this hadith doesn't exist before Shafi'i, with Shafi'i is attributed to the Prophet, therefore Shafi'i, someone made it up in this time period. You better go and search everything. At least everything that's published. At the time of Shah, much material was not published. A lot of books like the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq San'ani was not published. It's difficult to look at. Another important point he makes is that there's all sorts of reasons why someone might not transmit or have access to a hadith. The regional issue we discussed earlier. Different companions went to different cities. Ibn Mas'ud went to Kufa. Amr ibn al-As went to Egypt. Ibn Abbas stayed in Mecca. Other scholars went to Medina. Other people went to Yemen. Yes?
Is it true that Shaft also used, the sampling he used was incorrect, in that he used books of fiqh and polemical works of one madhab against another, as opposed to books of hadith?
Well, it depends, because the contains polemical works. I mean, the contains books like Ikhtilaf, Malik, and things like that. There's some of Shafi's works with debates with people are included in this book. Does that answer your question?
I think one of the points Anthony made is rather than use books of hadith to examine hadith, you use works of fiqh.
Well, for him, the distinction is immaterial, because if you're making a legal argument, that's even more reason why you should be bringing all the hadiths to bear that you could. So if you don't, in this case, then the hadith didn't exist. Now, later on, if you're talking about, a Hanbali scholar writing a book in the year 1300 or 1600, and he writes a book of fiqh and doesn't have hadith in it, that's because he doesn't want to bother you with that. He's giving you the rules of the Hanbali madhab. If I went and looked at this book and said, look at this, it doesn't have hadith in it. Muslims don't care about hadith. Hadiths are all made up after the year 1600 when this book was written. That would be a very bad argument. So it's possible that in the early period, and this is one of the arguments that Albany makes, which is that sometimes people get in debates and don't give you they don't feel the need to give all the evidence they have. This is again a common sense instance. We may be having a debate and I give you one hadith as my evidence and I don't give you 5 others. And what he brings up an excellent quote of a Shafi from Shafi's Risala, where Shafi says, in this book I'm going to give you, I write down material that I have memorized right now. Some of my books I don't have now. I know I have this hadith in another book with a full isnad, but I only have memorized this broken isnad version, which I'm writing down for you. So this is, sometimes they're away from their books, or they lost a book. So there's all sorts of instances in which someone is not going to be including the best possible evidence or exhaust all the evidence at their disposal. Now, yes?
Just very quickly on the exception versus the rule. When you mentioned that Shu'bah said that 3/4 of the hadith that I come across are forged or not true, how does that reconcile with what Mustafa al-Adali was saying about it being the exception rather than the rule?
I don't think, I'm not trying to say that forgery was the exception.
Yeah.
Remember, when you're talking about forgery, this is a society-wide issue. So the stuff that's forged completely doesn't even make it into, let's say, the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. To be in the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, you have to have an isnad. That was the first step in criticizing material. Imagine someone like Shu'bah sitting in Basra, and someone comes up to him and says, I heard the Prophet said that, the best women are women from Basra. Shu'bah says, who told you this? It's like, the Prophet said it, I heard. Okay, it's a waste of my time. Leave me alone. It's utter nonsense. You don't even know where this material comes from. That doesn't even get into the discussion. That's the stuff he's talking about. 3/4 of the material. Now he's collected, let's say, a book of hadiths with isnads. I don't think he means that 3/4 of this book are forged. I think he means 3/4 of the stuff floating around in the universe.
But the Orientalists will use that kind of statement of Hajjaj saying, look, 3/4 of the stuff that
yeah.
and say, oh, well, there you are.
Exactly. So if it's not put in context, it's easy to overestimate or overinterpret what that means. So when someone's saying, no, no one is doubting. Muslim scholars are not doubting that people made up hadiths for political purposes. Sometimes they include these hadiths in their books. And either they tell you it's made up or they don't say anything, and that's irresponsible. But it doesn't mean that that instance can be taken as representative of Muslims overall, especially because it's being identified as a case in which a scholar forged a hadith and was caught doing it.
Well, Shu'bah was in Basra as well, which is...
Yeah, but I'm talking about the Ghiyath ibn Ibrahim hadith in the Abbasid court. I mean, this is an instance where this person was caught doing it. Okay. Let's look now at revisionism. What is revisionism? When people say, this is historical revisionism. Revisionism in history is the idea that, study of history, is the idea that you are reevaluating what has come to be received opinion. You're reevaluating what has come to be received opinion on a topic. It's not in and of itself bad. Maybe the received opinion is nonsense or wrong, and you're revisiting it. The term is often used negatively. Now, this is just historical revisionism. But that's, I think, an inaccurate use of the term, because maybe it's correct to do this. But we'll use the term because it's useful, but we have to remember, I think, not to automatically assume that it's negative. What we're simply talking about is a movement amongst certain scholars to challenge the received opinion amongst Orientalists or amongst Western scholars of Islam about the origins of the religion. So, what this was a call for is its most well-known proponents are scholars like Patricia Crone, Michael Cook, Princeton, who's revised some of his ideas on this issue. People like Martin Hines, yes?
Hasn't Cook retracted from his position?
Yeah, he doesn't. His position on the Hagarism, he doesn't. As far as I know, I've not heard him say this, but I've heard his students say that he doesn't subscribe to the position he held in the Hagarism book, that it was more like an experiment, thought experiment.
There's a recent study on one of the Quranic palimpsest manuscripts, which asserts that Cook has even now gone further to assert that the Hadith tradition is plausible, historically plausible.
I don't know about I mean, I've read the article, the Sun Find article by Bahnam Sadiqi. That's the one.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, I don't remember that detail from the article, but the article's very good. What is the argument? The argument is, if you're going to apply the historical critical method, apply it all the way. Because what you've seen with people like Muir or Goldzahar, Shah, is they are critical of individual hadiths or a genre of hadiths, but they don't question the framework in which this drama is playing out. If the idea, and this goes back to the historical critical method, one of the principles is the principle of dissimilarity. You don't take someone's history from that person. You don't take Islamic history from Muslims, because Muslims are biased. Muslims are going to create a history that shows the religion as they want it to be. When do you accept things? When it makes them look bad. Because why would they write it? It must be true. But the whole framework, we don't have, there's not a Christian monk sitting in Medina at the time of the Prophet who's writing his memoirs about this really interesting time, and there's this guy Muhammad, he's come, and he's got this religion, and today he said this and that. We don't have this. Everything we know about the Prophet, in terms of details, specifics, is from Muslims. Why should we believe anything they say? If the earliest books of Sirah and Hadith were written in the early years of the 2nd century, 110, 100 Hijri, so 730, 740. If our earliest surviving books come from the late 700s, then this is over a century and a half, in which people could have completely made up the whole history of Islam. So if we're gonna follow the rules of the historical critical method, we're gonna take material from people who aren't biased. Let's do that. The argument by people like Corona is that there is nothing that can be reliably attributed to the Prophet. She takes as an example the case what's called the Constitution of Medina, or the Wathiqat al-Medina, which is the agreement in things like the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq the agreement between the Muslims and the Prophet and the Muslims and the non-Muslim tribes of Medina and the Jewish clans of Medina about being one polity, one ummah. Why had the majority of Western scholars accepted this as authentic? Because it uses the word ummah to talk about Muslims and non-Muslims together. Why would Muslims write that? Because Muslims are always talking about their ummah and how it's only Muslims, the believers. But look, early on, they used the word ummah to mean Christians and Jews together, and pagan Arabs. See, originally Islam was not as it is now. Originally it was this inclusive movement. I'm not saying that. This is the argument. So the fact that it used the word ummah as it does suggests that it's true. What Krona says is, actually, it's not authentic because it uses the word, it talks about the concept of wala, or patronage. So if I have a slave and I sell the slave, I'm entitled to a certain percentage of the slave's estate if the slave dies, even after I've freed him or her. It talks about this issue, but she says the earliest legal discussions we have don't mention this evidence. Don't mention this. Therefore, remember the argument is if it existed, it would have been used. Therefore, it didn't exist. So her argument is, if this one thing that really people believe is authentic isn't authentic, nothing's authentic. Cook even goes so far as to say that if we use the common link method, we see that even this isn't accurate. Because let's say you have a certain hadith about a theological idea, and because you believe that orthodoxy is manufactured, you believe that complex theology comes along later, that early on a religion its theology isn't fully formed, that by looking at the metans of certain hadiths, you know they were forged later, let's say the year 750, I'm just giving this as an example, but the common link would suggest that it's actually earlier, let's say 700, I'm just making this up. Therefore, even the common link doesn't work, because we know the hadith is actually later. And what they proposed is to look at non-Muslim sources. Some of them include this text, Greek text called Doctrina Jacobi Nuper Baptizati, the doctrine of Jacob the newly baptized, which is an anti-Jewish Christian polemic written about 634, so 2 years after the death of the Prophet, that mentions Islam. It says that it mentions it tangentially. It says a person arrived in North Africa and he says, yes, I came from Palestine, and there's this figure in Arabia who claims to be a prophet in the tradition of Moses. They've taken over Palestine. They killed one of the Roman magistrates, and he claims to have the keys to heaven. I think this is in the text. And there's other figures like the Armenian bishop Sebeos writing in the 680s, the Zuqnin Chronicle from a monastery in northwest Mesopotamia in the 680s, 660s, 670s. John of Phoenix writing around 687, another monk in Mesopotamia. These are non-Muslims writing about the early Islamic period. So they come up with this argument based on this material that Islam actually was an apocalyptic a dispensation of Judaism, in which these Arabs in Hijaz kind of rediscover their Abrahamic heritage, and they have this idea of this apocalyptic movement where they'll go with the Jews and recapture the Abrahamic homeland of Palestine. And that the idea of Muhammad as a leader, as a prophet, and all this stuff is later development. That's just a very, very basic summary of some of the general revisionist view of early Islamic history. There's many people who have ideas that are even more divergent from the received opinion of early Islamic history than that. Some people saying that the Quran itself, all of Islamic history is really made up after the year 800 of the Common Era, that it's an Abbasid creation. So there's a large menu of options or of choices for different revisionist visions of the early Islamic period. Some of them more extreme than others. Apparently I thought I was going to talk about more, but because I'm going to the next lecture, I will deal with rebuttals of this. How much more time do we have in this session? At least half an hour. How did I think? I must have thought that I was going to take longer to talk about this. Let me just look at what I had to say. No, right there. Oh yeah. Okay, so why don't I... You know what, actually this is fine because I just have more time to talk about other stuff, so I'll just keep going. What there is, this revisionist wave in the late 70s, especially in the early 80s, but until today there's scholars writing kind of revisionist versions of Islamic history, including my own professor Fred Donner in his last book about the Muhammad and the believers, including things like this, apparently this movie that was made, this documentary, which I haven't seen again, but from what I've read seems to be fairly revisionist, including scholars like this anonymous or pseudonymous Luxembourg and his writings about the Quran. The idea that the Quran, the whole narrative of the life of the Prophet, the narrative of Islamic origins, is all a creation of at least after 692. At least it's after the end of the Second Civil War. This is the sort of earliest point at which time Islam as a religion is created. And before that it was something else. This is maybe a general summary of the revisionist arguments. Now, some scholars have criticized this. Western scholars, non-Muslim scholars, and some of their arguments, actually one of their main critics is Fred Donner, who himself has a slightly revisionist version, but he's also very critical of people like Krona. And one of the arguments is who runs this conspiracy? I mean, you have basically a Muslim community that after 660 is racked by civil war. Several civil wars. Between 660 and 750 is the number of conflicts, internecine conflicts, is numerous, very large. Defies listing right now. It's spread from West Africa to Sindh, from Central Asia to Yemen, in a time period in which communication, any kind of central state control is very difficult. How can you possibly have a conspiracy that creates the person of Muhammad? I mean, you have evidence in Hadith collections, in history books. You have evidence of people promoting pro-Shiite agenda, pro-Sunni agenda, pro-Kharijite agenda, pro-Umayyad agenda, pro-Abbasid agenda, pro-Kufan agenda, pro-Basran agenda, pro-Persian agenda, pro-Arab agenda. All this material is evident. Yet they all agree that there was this Prophet Muhammad, that he lived at a certain time, that he was very important, that his precedent is authoritative in some way or the other. So they're able to, they can't agree on anything. They're fighting with each other, literally. But somehow they all agree to have this conspiracy where they invent the story of the Prophet in the Quran and things like that. And by the way, the Quran doesn't have any evidence of this. There's no, Ali isn't mentioned in the Quran. Abu Bakr is not mentioned in the Quran by name. The Umayyads aren't mentioned in the Quran. The Abbasids aren't mentioned in the Quran. The Basrans aren't mentioned in the Quran. The Kufans aren't mentioned in the Quran. So somehow this document is preserved without, they come together and they decide, we're going to make something up that doesn't have any evidence of being scarred by our conflicts. They get together in a big conference, and although they can't agree on anything, they agree to do this project. This is not utter nonsense. It's impossible. I think. I mean, I think it's plainly impossible. In fact, the whole argument of people like Fred Donner for the fact that the Quran is a very early document, it comes from before 692 in his opinion, is that it doesn't bear any of the evidence of these civil wars. The Hadith collections do. Hadith collections, if you look at them, there's plenty of evidence that you would say, this was made up during the civil wars to support one side or the other. The Quran doesn't have that. I'll go down to this. I realize that it's actually better for me to go down to the point number 4, what stories do the non-Muslim sources really tell? Because if we do say, you know, we don't trust Muslims, let's not listen to Muslims about their religion or their history. Let's only look at non-Muslims. If we actually look at what the full picture, the full image that these sources convey, what you see is something that's not that different from what Muslims think. And this, if I recommend a book by, I think he's a wonderful historian, Robert Hoyland, British, but I don't know where he works now, if he's in the UK or in Oxford. I always wanted to meet him. It's a very, oh really? Oh, he's coming to the US too, to Georgetown to give a lecture. I'm very excited. I've really enjoyed his books over the years. In his book, Islam as Others, I think Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, or Seeing Islam as Others See It, I can't remember the exact title. But he's a discussion at the end, which is excellent. He says, let's actually look at what, just taken together, what do these sources say? You know, if you look at John of Phoenix and the Zucnin Chronicle and Sebeos and Doctrina Jacobi, you get this composite image that there was a person named Muhammad, that he was the Mahdaya, he was the guide, the Syriac word for the guide of the Muslims, that he preached the religion of Abraham, that he taught the Arabs about the one God, he forbade lying and eating carrion, that the Muslims took the sunnah of their prophet really seriously, the law of their prophet really seriously, and punished people who didn't obey it, that they built mosques, houses of worship that tried to face Mecca, that they saw themselves as in the tradition of Moses, that this was all happening in the 630s. This is all, this is not that, I mean, you don't get the details. You don't get, you know, the prophet said this and the prophet said that, the details of Hadith. But the general narrative seems to be confirmed. And there's nothing there that is unusual for a Muslim. And if there are things in these non-Muslim writings that differ with what Muslims say, or that seem to be denigrating, well, that's not surprising. Because one, some of these figures don't have a lot of information about Muslims. Two, they don't like Muslims. They are writing about the group that has taken over their lands and is a scourge of God, bringing a heretical religion. It's interesting, they don't complain. They talk about Muawiyah's rule as being a time of justice and prosperity. They say the Muslims, they don't really care about your religion as long as you pay your taxes. They don't really care what religion you follow. Interestingly, one of their criticisms, I think it's the John of Phoenix says this, one of his criticisms is that the Muslims don't persecute Jews enough. Said about this. Because the Byzantine emperor in 632 issued an edict that to forcibly convert all Jews of the Byzantine Empire to Christianity. Not a lot of people know this. He issued an edict to forcibly convert all the Jews of the Byzantine Empire to Christianity. Why didn't that get carried out? Because of the Muslim conquests. So there's a reason why in a lot of areas, especially Egypt, the population welcomed the Muslim invaders. Why did the Muslim conquerors set up capital in Fustat, which it's now Cairo? Why not Alexandria, which is the actual capital? Because they went in with, and the Byzantine emperor had appointed his own patriarch of Alexandria, not accepted the patriarch who represented the religious beliefs of the people in Egypt at the time. That patriarch was kind of an outlaw, and he basically was, the Muslims were going to install him as a patriarch. And their invasion and occupation, not of Alexandria, but of the area around Cairo, was done with the cooperation of the Christian leadership in that area. And one of the arguments for why they set up their camp there in Fustat was because they wanted to use the monasteries in that area to help them administer the region. Because Muslims, remember, they don't know how to do taxes or anything. They're Bedouins. They don't know how to deal with agricultural tax. So they needed the existing administrative elite of places like Syria and Central Asia and Egypt. So the argument being that really these non-Muslim sources don't tell a story that's dramatically different from the Muslim sources. What about arguments against Schacht and Goldziher and Yoinbol? We already mentioned the defenses put up by people like Adami, but other scholars built on that. Harold Motzky, for example, a German scholar who's now retired, he's not Muslim. He says very clearly, I'm not interested in defending hadiths. I'm not trying to defend the Islamic tradition against critics. But what I'm trying to do is to actually take the evidence seriously and not just judge it without real scholarly investigation. We may conclude that a certain hadith is made up, or that a certain set of hadiths are forged. But we shouldn't conclude this without analyzing the evidence closely. And he introduces a method of analysis that he calls isnad cum-metin analysis, isnad and metin analysis, which is based on a few assumptions. That the isnads that Muslims include in their books in some way represent real transmissions that occurred, in some way. That the contents of hadiths usually tend to be consistent along the lines of these transmissions. That a certain transmission will include certain detail on the metin, another one will include another detail. And he comes to these conclusions based on his own experience in reading. These are important assumptions of his analysis. And what he does is, if you take into consideration the actual breadth of the Islamic tradition, so instead of just using the 6 books, so Yoinbol basically used a book called Tuhfat al-Ashraf by Jamal ad-Din al-Mizzi, who died 742-1341, a colleague of al-Dhahabi and Ibn Taymiyyah in Damascus. It's essentially a map of the isnads in the 6 books and a few other small collections. And he uses this to construct the isnad trees that he analyzes. And he might add a few other books like the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But this is a tiny fragment of all the material, even from that early period. The Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani, the Musannaf of Abu Bakr ibn Abi Shayba, the Jami' of Ibn Wahb, the collections of Tabarani, the collections of Ibn Abi Dunya. Tremendous material. And what Motzky does is he actually goes and looks at all this material. He puts in the effort that Muslim scholars put in, at least to follow what they did. And I wrote a review of Yoinbol's book, and I feel bad because he's now dead, passed away. I don't want to speak ill of the dead. But I will say that what I said in the review is he complains about how, why did they think so atomistically about hadith? Why didn't they realize that if they put all these isnad trees together, they'll figure out that this material was forged? Well, where did you get these isnad trees? From their book. I mean, you used a book that is documenting these isnad trees. You're saying they're thinking atomistically and not holistically. But that's like saying, I mentioned this in the review, that's like saying that, you know, a society is unordered and disorganized by using their own phone book to say that. This is a list of everybody who lives in a country, alphabetically with address and phone number. How can you say that they're not? I mean, this is, you're contradicting yourself. The very basis of your argument contradicts your argument. And, you know, why didn't they come to your conclusion that this stuff is made up? Because they don't have your assumptions, that it's all made up. They don't believe that just because there's not something before a common link that it was made up. Because these come from assumptions that are specific to one culture, one civilization, one historical approach. Is that okay? All right, sorry. So when he looks at his articles and book chapters really focus on specific hadiths, and he especially used the Musannaf of Abdurrazzaq Sanani. So Abdurrazzaq Sanani died 217, I think, 211 or 217, I can't remember exactly. 211. And what is that in Miladi? Like 826. Okay. Yeah, okay. So he looks at this material, and what he says is, if you actually look at this huge breadth, you find that the common link is earlier than that someone like Yuan-Bo would have thought. It's not a successor or one of the next generation. Sometimes the common links are companions. So you're pushing back a hadith to the late 600s, the time of people who knew the Prophet. And if the argument is that if there's a common link, then the hadith really existed at that time, what you're saying is it existed at the time of the companions of the Prophet, which is not that different than what, I mean, it's not far stretch of the imagination to say that it comes from the Prophet. I mean, you're basically getting back into the era of what Muslims would say. Now, he doesn't say this for all hadiths. He looks at specific ones. But what he says is, look, this material, some of it really seems to go back to the late 600s, the Common Era. Another thing he does is he looks at the transmissions of specific sources in Abdurrazzaq Sanani's Musannaf. He looks at Ibn Jurayj, who died 150. He looks at Ma'mar bin Rashid, who died 153 of the Common Era. He looks at the transmissions of al-Zuhri. And what he sees is that there seems to be real consistency in what Ibn Jurayj transmits, in what Ma'mar bin Rashid transmits. And that they will sometimes transmit material that they don't agree with, that contradicts their opinions on law. So if they're making this stuff up, why are they making stuff up that contradicts them? There's no reason for that. That they'll sometimes transmit things and say, I don't know what this means. It makes no sense to me. I don't know what this word means. I don't know what this movie means. Why would they make stuff up and then say, I don't know what it means? What he concludes is that people like Ibn Jurayj, Ma'mar bin Rashid, so we're talking about, you know, the generation, 2 generations from the companions, but they were really, seem to be reliably transmitting material, which gets you back to their sources in the early 100s Hijri, so the early 700s or late 600s. And this is, again, you're getting to the time of the companions. Not so different than what a Muslim would say. Now, a Muslim might say that this comes from the Prophet, but you're really pushing back the date of when this material can be established as existing historically from the early 700s to the late 600s, the time of the companions.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
By the way, I went to Chicago the year you left.
Oh, you went to Chicago to the university?
Yeah. Mohsen talked about you to me a lot.
Mohsen?
Mohsen.
Yeah, Mohsen from Nedwa.
Mohsen, that's right. Yeah. Anyway, I actually did meet Fred Donna, took some classes with him and stuff like But nevertheless, my question for you is that something that I'm working on myself as well. But I want to put it as a question to you, just to see how you think about it. Certainly, the principles that we carry influence the judgment calls that we make. Right? So a capitalist judgment call will be very different from a communist judgment call. What principle, essentially, do you think the West has got right or wrong that's causing it to make the judgment calls that they're making in relation to the Hadith tradition? And I say this because I actually did point this out with Patricia in front of Fred Donner, and I made her apologize for this. Because she came and it was an interesting, although Islamic science is not, I'm more in philosophy. But I just want to say...
Well, what was the, hey, I'm curious, what was the thing you got her to apologize for?
It was a number of things. There was about 3 or 4 issues that me and Patricia sort of, she got so upset with me afterwards. She goes, how dare you do this to me in front of everyone? But nevertheless, and Fred Donner came up...
But what was the, I'm curious, what was the point?
No, I'll talk about that afterwards because that's very much related to the question that I've just posed to you.
Okay, I mean the question is what principles do you think that...
Dr. Brown?
Yes.
Can we leave that question for Sheikh Akram's here? I think it'd be a good panel discussion and good answer. So if we can present that till later.
Fine with me.
Both of your views on it. Is that okay? I'm sorry, you have to repeat the question.
The reason I asked this question...
Were you here last time for the last session at the beginning?
No, I just...
Well, I talked a lot about where the origins of principles are, and what the origins of principles of historical critical method are, and which of them are right or wrong is another issue we can talk about later. But the principles come out of, I mean, they come out of a, to be very brief, they come out of a rediscovery of Greco-Roman tradition, which is cynical, historically cyclical. There's not with this idea that principle of analogy, societies are always functioning the same way. That is secular, in effect.
Okay,
it doesn't acknowledge it doesn't acknowledge.
Let him answer the question and then we'll leave it until later on.
No, I'm not answering the question. I'm asking another question.
Well, you can only ask one question at a time. You want to know the principles, or do you not want to know the principles? Otherwise, I won't tell them because I already told them. Right? A secular vision. If you read Herodotus's histories, he died around 420 BC. He doesn't buy the interference of gods in reality. Sometimes he does, sometimes. But when he talks about the Trojan War, he doubts the whole premise of the Trojan War. People don't fight over women like this. No one's not going to go 10-year war because someone has some. Why didn't they return Helen? Who would fight a 10-year war? If some guy stole another man's wife, and just to give her back. This is nonsense. He says that Helen was never in Troy. So this is very interesting. This idea that doubts the involvement of the gods, doubts this what he feels is irrational way people, because people don't remember, people always behave the same way. Principle of analogy. It comes out of the humanist tradition of going back to early textual sources. It leads people like Desiderius Erasmus, died 1536, to, in his reconstruction of the original Greek Old Testament, to realize that certain verses, the verse that is the only explicit mentioning of the Trinity in the New Testament, that he realized this is not originally part of the New Testament. That leads them to the Renaissance sentiment that world is getting better, that they are in an era, living in an era where new knowledge is being discovered. When you read someone like Louis Leroy died 1575, he talks about how we're making advances in knowledge that's never made before. They start the willingness to question established truths is absolutely essential from the 1500s until today. The fact that people, in the late 1700s, say that Homer didn't write the Iliad and the Odyssey. There was no person named Homer who wrote both these books. They're overturning a pillar of the Western literary canon. This confidence to overturn truths, established truths. The Protestant Reformation, which destroys control of interpretation of a text. The concomitant political liberalization in places like the Dutch Republic and eventually in England, in Holland in 1600 onward, in England after this English Civil War, and the recension of the censorship laws, or the lapsing of the censorship laws in England in the 1690s, creates freedom to think and express ideas. Discovery of the New World, discovering people who didn't fit into the biblical history of Noah and Adam, people who don't exist in the Aristotelian map of the world. It completely overturns what many of the assumptions that intellectuals in the European tradition had. And you can see this very clearly if you read books like the Essays of Montaigne, who died in 1592. It was a very good example. So these things all go into the basic principles of historical critical method.
Should we say 10 minutes and then back? Is Motsky done?
Yeah, I can just talk about these other ones next. That's fine. There's a very small point.
10 minutes, please.